The adult horror of the burning bell tower. It was on a night thick with the scent of smoke and ash that I, Samuel Graves, first heard the tolling of the bell. I had been a resident of the small town of Ashford for many years, a quiet, unremarkable place nestled among the hills, far from the chaos of the city. The bell tower had long been a fixture of the town's skyline, a silent sentinel watching over the cobblestone streets and the humble cottages below. But that all changed the night the fire came. It began as a mere flicker, a spark that caught in the dry timber of the tower. The townspeople watched in horror as the flames spread, devouring the structure with an insatiable hunger. By the time the fire brigade arrived, it was too late. The bell tower was reduced to smoldering ruins, its once proud bell now a molten heap of metal, its voice forever silenced. But that was not the end. The fire had claimed many lives, innocent souls who had been caught in its wake. Among them were the townspeople who had been in the tower at the time, seeking shelter from the flames. Their screams, I was told, had echoed through the streets, a haunting sound that would forever linger in the minds of those who had heard it. And yet, the most chilling part of the tragedy was what happened after the flames had died down, after the ashes had settled. At midnight, the bell tolled. I was sitting in my study, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the room, when the sound first reached my ears. It was a deep, resonant chime, the kind that would normally be heard in the dead of night to mark the passing of time. But this was no ordinary toll. The sound was hollow, as though it came from the very depths of the earth, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I rose from my chair, my heart pounding in my chest. The bell tower had been destroyed, its bell melted in the fire. And yet, the tolling continued, echoing through the town like a ghostly summons. I knew, even before I stepped outside, that something was terribly wrong. As I made my way into the streets, I saw others, my neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, all drawn to the sound, their faces pale with fear. We stood in the town square, gazing up at the ruins of the bell tower, the air thick with the stench of smoke. And then, as the clock struck midnight, we saw them. The fiery apparitions emerged from the wreckage, their forms wreathed in flames, their eyes burning with an otherworldly rage. They were the spirits of those who had perished in the fire, their bodies consumed by the inferno, their souls bound to the tower in a twisted mockery of life. They drifted through the streets, their cries of agony and fury filling the night air, their outstretched hands reaching for those who had once called this town home. The apparitions were not content to simply haunt us. No, they sought vengeance. They sought retribution for the wrongs that had been done to them, for the lives that had been taken in the fire. As they passed, the flames that wreathed their bodies would scorch the earth, leaving behind a trail of burning footprints that seemed to linger long after they had vanished. The first to fall was Thomas Hale, a merchant who had long been known for his greed and cruelty. He had taken advantage of the town's poor, charging exorbitant prices for his wares, and had been rumored to have cheated many out of their hard-earned savings. As the fiery apparition of a woman, her face twisted in anguish, approached him, he screamed in terror, his hands raised in a futile attempt to shield himself. But the apparition paid him no heed. She reached out, her fingers touching his chest, and in an instant, his body was engulfed in flames. He fell to the ground, writhing in agony, his screams mingling with the crackling of the fire. Next was Margaret Blythe, a widow who had been known for her cruelty toward the children of the town. She had been harsh, unkind, and had taken pleasure in punishing those who had wronged her. As the apparition of a young child, her face burned and disfigured, approached Margaret, the woman's eyes widened in terror. She tried to flee, but the child's small hand reached out, touching her arm. Margaret's skin began to blister and burn, and within moments, she was consumed by the flames, her body collapsing into a heap of ash. The apparitions did not discriminate. They sought out those who had wronged them, those who had caused their suffering, and they made sure that their vengeance was swift and fiery. The tolling of the bell continued, each chime marking another soul claimed by the flames. I, too, was not spared. As the clock struck the final toll of midnight, I felt a sudden searing pain in my chest. I looked down to see my own skin blistering, my clothes smoldering as though they were being consumed by an invisible fire. The apparition of a man, his face charred and unrecognizable, emerged before me. The adult horror of the Crimson Pact. The letter arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday, its crimson seal catching the light as it landed on Eleanor's doorstep. The envelope bore no return address, only her name written in elegant script. Inside, a single card read, "You have been chosen to join the Crimson Pact. Eternal youth, boundless beauty, and unmatched power await you. Attend our gathering at the appointed hour." Eleanor scoffed at the notion. She was a practical woman, her life built on logic and hard work. Yet, as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, the fine lines around her eyes and the gray streaks in her hair seemed to mock her. She had spent years sacrificing for her family, pouring herself into their well-being, and now, at 47, she felt invisible. Curiosity, mixed with a hint of desperation, led her to the address provided. The mansion was hidden deep in the woods, its towering silhouette bathed in moonlight. A butler greeted her at the door, his expression unreadable. "Welcome, Miss Eleanor," he said, leading her into a grand hall filled with guests dressed in red and black. Their faces glowed with an ethereal beauty, their laughter intoxicating. She felt out of place in her modest dress, but a woman with piercing green eyes and a knowing smile approached her. "You're nervous," the woman said, offering Eleanor a glass of wine. "Don't be. The pact has been a blessing for all of us." Eleanor hesitated but took a sip. The wine was rich, its warmth spreading through her body. The woman leaned in closer. "Tonight you'll understand what it means to truly live." The ceremony began at midnight. The guests gathered in a circular chamber beneath the mansion, its walls adorned with ancient symbols. At the center stood an altar draped in crimson cloth. The leader of the society, a man with an ageless face and a voice like silk, addressed the crowd. "Welcome, Eleanor," he said, his gaze piercing. "You stand on the threshold of eternity. The Crimson Pact offers you youth, beauty, and power beyond imagination. But every gift requires a sacrifice." The room fell silent as the leader gestured toward a pair of ornate doors. They creaked open, revealing Eleanor's family, her husband, her daughter, and her son, bound and gagged. Her heart stopped. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The leader smiled, his expression serene. "The pact is sealed with blood. You must choose their lives for your eternal youth, or walk away and return to the life you know." Eleanor's mind raced. She thought of the years she had spent feeling unappreciated, the sacrifices that had gone unnoticed. Yet, as she looked into her children's terrified eyes, the weight of her love for them crushed her resentment. "I can't do this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The leader's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "Then you forfeit your place among us. But know this, refusal has its own price." The guests began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. The symbols on the walls glowed, and the air grew heavy. Eleanor's family vanished before her eyes, their screams echoing in the chamber. "No!" she cried, lunging toward the altar, but an invisible force held her back. The leader approached, his eyes now black as voids. "You have rejected the pact, but the blood debt remains. You will live, Eleanor, but you will bear the mark of your choice." She awoke the next morning in her bed, her body trembling. The mansion, the society, her family, it all felt like a nightmare. But as she stumbled to the mirror, she saw the truth. Her reflection was unrecognizable. Her face gaunt, her hair white, her eyes hollow. The Crimson Pact had taken its price, leaving her a shell of her former self. And in the silence of her empty home, she could still hear the faint echoes of her family's screams, a haunting reminder of the cost of her decision. The adult horror of the endless party. It began with an invitation, gilded in gold and sealed with wax as crimson as fresh blood. The envelope bore no name, only the symbol of a masked figure, its eyes hollow and lips twisted into a faint smile. For those who received it, the allure was irresistible. "You are cordially invited to the midnight masquerade," the card read. "An evening of unparalleled indulgence awaits. Come and leave your inhibitions at the door." Sophia Hargrove, a woman of taste and ambition, clutched the invitation with trembling hands. She had heard whispers of this party, tales of decadence and excess that defied imagination. It was said that only the most elite, the most daring, were invited. And now she was among them. The location was a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, its gates flanked by statues of leering gargoyles. A long line of sleek cars snaked up the drive, their passengers stepping out in elaborate costumes and masks that glittered under the light of a blood-red moon. Sophia's mask was a delicate creation of black lace, its edges adorned with tiny obsidian stones. As she entered the grand ballroom, her breath caught. The scene before her was one of surreal opulence. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, tables groaned under the weight of exotic delicacies, and the air was thick with the mingling scents of perfume and spiced wine. Music, haunting and hypnotic, filled the room, played by a string quartet whose faces were obscured by masks of pure white. "Welcome," a man's voice purred. Sophia turned to see a figure clad in a black velvet suit, his mask a featureless expanse of gold. "Tonight, there are no limits. Indulge in every desire. But remember, once you enter, you cannot leave until dawn." Sophia's unease was fleeting, swept away by the intoxicating atmosphere. She allowed herself to be led into the revelry, her senses overwhelmed by the hedonistic spectacle. Wine flowed like water, laughter rang out like bells, and every corner of the mansion seemed to hold a new delight. But as the hours stretched on, something shifted. The laughter grew shrill, the music discordant. Sophia noticed the faces of the guests, their expressions frozen in masks of ecstasy that bordered on agony. She saw a woman gorging herself on a platter of candied fruits, her hands trembling as though she couldn't stop. A man danced wildly, his feet moving faster and faster until they bled, leaving red streaks on the marble floor. "When does the party end?" Sophia asked a passing waiter, her voice trembling. The man's face, pale and drawn, twisted into a grotesque smile. "It doesn't," he whispered. "Not until the master wills it." Panic began to set in. Sophia sought out the man in the golden mask, but he was nowhere to be found. She tried to leave, but the grand doors were locked, their handles ice cold to the touch. The windows showed only darkness, no hint of the world beyond. Hours turned to days, or so it seemed. Time lost all meaning. The guests, once vibrant and beautiful, now resembled gaunt specters, their movements mechanical, their laughter hollow. Sophia's own reflection in a gilded mirror startled her. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pallid, her lips cracked and dry. Yet she could not stop drinking the wine, could not stop eating the food, could not stop dancing. It was then that she saw him, the master of the masquerade. He stood at the top of a grand staircase, his golden mask glinting in the dim light. His voice, smooth as silk, echoed through the room. "You wanted indulgence," he said, his tone mocking. "You wanted to escape the mundane. Now you are free from it all, free to revel for eternity." "Please," Sophia begged, her voice cracking, "let us go." The master's laughter was a low, chilling sound. "There is no escape," he said. "The party never ends." As his words settled over the room, the music swelled to a deafening crescendo. The guests, their faces contorted in silent screams, continued their endless revelry. Sophia felt herself pulled back into the throng, her body moving against her will. The last shred of her resistance dissolved, leaving only the hollow shell of a woman lost to the endless night. And so the midnight masquerade continued, a celebration of unrestrained indulgence turned to torment, a night that would never end. The adult horror of the forbidden manuscript. It was on a night, the darkness of which seemed to crawl across the land with a malice all its own, that I, Edward Hargrave, a writer of little repute, stumbled upon a book that would alter the very course of my existence. For months I had wandered the streets of London, my pen poised but impotent, unable to capture the words that might secure my name among the greats. The publisher's rejections weighed heavy upon my soul, and I, a man once proud of my craft, found myself sinking into the pit of despair. It was then, in the most curious of places, that I discovered the book. A small, dimly lit antiquarian shop tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, a place where time seemed to stand still, its very air thick with the musty scent of old paper and dust. I had entered with little hope, but as I wandered through the aisles, my gaze fell upon a peculiar volume. Bound in dark, weathered leather, its pages yellowed with age, the book seemed to call to me in a language I could not understand. Its title, The Forbidden Manuscript, was etched in gold letters upon the spine, faint and almost imperceptible, as though the book itself sought to hide its name. Compelled by an impulse I could not explain, I reached for the book and without a second thought purchased it. The price was laughably small, and yet I felt an unease as the coins exchanged hands. The shopkeeper, an old man with hollow eyes, gave me a look that seemed both pitying and knowing. "Be careful, sir," he said in a voice that seemed to echo from some distant, forgotten place. "Some things are best left undisturbed." I laughed at his warning, but deep within me, a strange unease began to stir. At home, I opened the book with trembling hands. The pages were brittle, and the ink was faded, yet the words upon them were as clear as day. I had no idea what I was reading, yet I could not stop myself from continuing. It was as though the book itself had a will, a power that compelled me to read, to speak aloud the incantations inscribed within its pages. The first chapter spoke of ambition, of the burning desire to achieve greatness. It was a simple enough spell, one that promised to grant its reader success beyond their wildest dreams. With little thought, I recited the words aloud, feeling a strange warmth fill the room as the last syllable left my lips. The next morning, I awoke to find a letter from a prestigious publisher, a name I had longed to hear for years. They wished to meet me to discuss my work. And so, within the span of days, I found myself a published author, my name on the lips of critics, my work lauded as a masterpiece. But with the success came a creeping darkness, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. I could not explain it at first. It was as if something was watching me, something old, ancient, and malevolent. At night, I would hear whispers in the walls, soft murmurs that seemed to come from the very pages of the book. The warmth that had filled my room upon reciting the spell had turned to a chill, a cold that crept into my bones, gnawing at me as I slept. I tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as the product of my overworked mind, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And soon they were no longer whispers, but voices, clear and distinct, urging me to continue reading, to unlock the next chapter of the book. In a moment of weakness, I gave in. I turned to the second chapter, the one that promised even greater rewards: wealth, power, influence. It was as if the book knew my deepest desires, knew the very things I craved. I read the words aloud once more, feeling a surge of energy course through me, a power unlike any I had ever known. The next day, I found myself in the company of the rich and powerful, dining in the finest establishments, rubbing elbows with those whose names were spoken in hushed reverence. My every wish was granted, my every command obeyed. I was no longer the struggling writer I had once been. I was a man of importance, a man of influence. But with the success came the price. The darkness grew stronger. The whispers became screams, echoing in my mind, demanding that I continue. The book was no longer a mere object. It was a living thing, its pages turning on their own, as if it were alive and feeding off my desires. And then, the sacrifices began. The first was small, a pet, a cat I had cared for with affection. It was found in the alley behind my house, its body mangled beyond recognition. I could not explain it, but I knew, deep within me, that the book had demanded it. The second sacrifice was more significant. A close friend, a man I had known for years, who had always supported my work. He disappeared without a trace, his body never found. And yet, as I stood in the quiet of my study, I could hear his voice, calling to me from the pages of the manuscript, urging me to read on. I knew then that there would be no escape. The adult horror of the silent abbey. It was a night of tempestuous fury, the kind that seemed to awaken the very spirits of the earth and sky. William and Eleanor Hargrave, a couple whose youthful love had matured into a union of quiet devotion, found themselves caught in the throes of the storm as they journeyed through the desolate moors of Northumbria. Their carriage, buffeted by relentless winds and rain, came to an abrupt halt as the horses refused to go further, their eyes wide with terror at some unseen specter ahead. "We cannot remain here," William declared, his voice steady despite the howling gale. "There is shelter ahead, the Abbey. Do you see it, Eleanor?" Through the sheets of rain, Eleanor's gaze followed his pointing hand. Looming in the distance was the dark silhouette of a structure, its spires clawing at the heavens. The abbey stood like a sentinel, ancient and foreboding, its stone walls weathered by centuries of solitude. "We have no choice," Eleanor whispered, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Together they made their way through the storm, the abbey's great wooden doors creaking open under William's determined push. The interior was a stark contrast to the storm outside. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and aged wood, and the silence was almost oppressive. Their footsteps echoed eerily as they ventured further inside, their lantern casting flickering shadows that danced upon the cold walls. "This place has not known life for many years," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. William nodded, his eyes scanning the vast, empty nave. The pews were intact but dust-covered, and a massive crucifix loomed over the altar, its carved figure of Christ gazing down with an expression of infinite sorrow. They found a small chamber off the main hall, its hearth still intact. William managed to kindle a fire, its warmth a fragile barrier against the chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the abbey. As they settled in, Eleanor's unease grew. "Do you hear it?" she asked suddenly, her hand gripping William's arm. "Hear what?" he replied, tilting his head to listen. "The silence. It's not natural. It's deliberate." William dismissed her concerns, attributing them to the storm and their exhaustion. Yet as the hours passed, the silence grew heavier, pressing down on them like a physical weight. It was then that they heard the first sound, a faint rustling, as though robes brushed against stone. Eleanor's breath caught. "William, we are not alone." The sound grew louder, and soon shadowy figures began to emerge from the darkness. Monks, their cowled heads bowed and hands clasped in prayer, moved in solemn procession. Their forms were translucent, their faces obscured by shadow, but their presence was undeniable. William and Eleanor watched in horrified silence as the spectral monks filed into the nave. They took their places in the pews, their heads still bowed, and the air grew colder with their arrival. One figure, taller and more imposing than the rest, stepped forward. He raised his hand, and the silence became absolute, suffocating. A voice echoed in their minds, deep and resonant, as though it came from the stones themselves. "You have entered a sacred place, bound by a vow of silence. None who speak here may leave unpunished." Panic seized Eleanor. "What does he mean? William, what does he mean?" Her words shattered the silence like glass, and the monks turned their cowled heads toward her in unison. The air vibrated with an unholy energy, and the spectral abbot raised his hand once more. Eleanor's voice choked off, her hands flying to her throat as though an invisible force constricted it. "Eleanor!" William shouted, rushing to her side. But as he spoke, the same force seized him, and he fell to his knees, gasping for air. The monks began to chant, their voices low and mournful, a dirge that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. The sound grew louder, more oppressive, until it was all the couple could hear. The fire in the hearth extinguished itself, plunging the chamber into darkness. The last thing William saw before the blackness claimed him was the spectral abbot standing over them, his face a void of shadow. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, and the abbey stood silent once more. Travelers passing through the moors would later find the couple's carriage abandoned, the horses gone, and the great wooden doors of the abbey ajar. Inside, they discovered two figures kneeling before the altar, their hands clasped in eternal prayer. Their faces were serene, but their eyes were wide with the terror of what they had seen and what they had become. The abbey's silence remained unbroken, save for the whispers of the wind and the faint rustle of robes in the darkness. The adult horror of the bleeding portrait. It was on a crisp autumn evening, when the winds howled through the streets of London, that I, Gregory Delacroix, a man of considerable wealth and stature in the art world, found myself drawn to a mysterious auction. The event was held in a private, dimly lit gallery, where the finest works of art were offered to those who could afford them. I had attended many such gatherings in my lifetime, each more opulent than the last, but none had prepared me for what I was about to encounter. Among the numerous paintings that adorned the walls of the gallery, there was one that stood apart from the rest, a portrait unlike any I had ever seen. It was an oil painting of a woman, her eyes deep and sorrowful, her lips curled in a faint, knowing smile. The brushstrokes were masterful, capturing the texture of her flowing gown, the glint of moonlight in her eyes, and the subtle, almost imperceptible hint of anguish on her face. But what struck me most was the fact that her gaze seemed to follow me as I moved through the room, a sensation so unnerving that I could scarcely tear my eyes away. The auctioneer, an old man with a voice that cracked like dry parchment, spoke of the painting's provenance. "This is no ordinary work," he said, his words dripping with reverence. "It is said to have been painted by an unknown master, one whose name has been lost to history. But there is something more, something that cannot be explained by mere artistry." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. The auctioneer continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. It is rumored that at midnight the painting bleeds. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but I dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man trying to add intrigue to a painting's value. Yet, something about the portrait, something in the woman's eyes, compelled me to bid. And so, with little hesitation, I raised my paddle. The price was steep, far beyond what I had anticipated, but I could not resist. I had to possess it. As the final gavel fell, sealing my acquisition, a strange sense of unease settled over me. I had won the painting, but at what cost? That night, as I stood before the portrait in my study, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woman's eyes seemed to glimmer in the candlelight, her sorrowful gaze piercing through the dim room. I tried to dismiss the sensation, but it lingered, a chill that crept up my spine. At midnight I was awoken by a sound, a faint dripping, like water falling onto the floor. I rose from my bed, my heart pounding, and made my way to the study. There, to my horror, I found the portrait bleeding. Thick, dark crimson dripped from the woman's eyes, staining the canvas and pooling on the floor below. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The blood seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, as though it were drawing something from me, something deep within my soul. But it was not just the blood that horrified me, it was what followed. As I gazed upon the painting, I felt my mind begin to unravel. The blood, as it dripped, seemed to form images, visions of my past, of the sins I had committed in my pursuit of wealth and power. Faces I had long forgotten, people I had wronged, whispered names that echoed in my ears. The blood revealed all that I had hidden, all that I had buried beneath layers of pride and arrogance. I saw the faces of the artists I had exploited, their eyes hollow with betrayal. I saw the beggars I had ignored, their hands outstretched in desperation. I saw the woman I had once loved, her heart shattered by my indifference. Each vision was a knife, carving into my conscience, exposing the darkness I had long denied. The blood did not stop, nor did the visions. With each drop, the sins of my past grew clearer, more vivid, until I could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. My thoughts became a tangled web of guilt and madness, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. I turned away from the painting, desperate to escape the horrors it revealed. But as I fled the room, I could hear the voice of the woman, her whisper, soft and insistent, as though it were coming from the very walls of my home. "You cannot escape," she murmured. "You cannot escape your sins." The days that followed were a blur of confusion and terror. I could no longer sleep, for each night the portrait bled, and each night the visions grew more vivid, more grotesque. I tried to hide the painting, to lock it away in a dark room, but it was always there, always waiting for the stroke of midnight. I began to lose my mind. The sins of my past became unbearable, each one a weight that crushed me from within. I could no longer bear to look at myself in the mirror, for the face that stared back at me was no longer mine. It was the face of a man consumed by guilt, a man whose very soul had been stained by the blood of his own misdeeds. And yet the portrait called to me.